Okay, today we're going to talk about solving quadratic equations by completing the square. We've done this before, but now we're going to end up with imaginary numbers as our answer. So please make sure that you take out a sheet of loose leaf paper if you chose not to print out these notes. So to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square, the first thing we're going to do is isolate the terms with the variables on one side, plain numbers to the other. Then we're going to write x plus a space squared equals answer plus blank. We're going to cut the number in front of the x term and in half and put it in the parentheses after the variable. So we're going to put the number that's cut in half here. Then we're going to square that term that we just cut in half and put it in the blank. It will always be positive. Make sure you put a star here. Then we're going to solve the equation. So if we look at the first example, we want letters on the left and numbers on the right. So the first thing I'm going to do is subtract 82 from both sides. So now I have n squared plus 16n equals negative 92. The second thing I'm going to do is write squared equals negative 92 plus blank. I'm going to put an n here because we're working with an n instead of an x. Now I'm going to take the number in front of the n term, or the x term. We're going to cut that in half. Half of 16 is 8. Now I'm going to take this number and I'm going to square it and put it here. So now this leaves me with negative 28 here, and I have n plus 8 squared equals negative 28. Now to solve our equation, to get rid of this squared, the opposite of squaring is square rooting. So now I have n plus 8 equals, if I look at the negative 28, if I wanted to simplify that, the first thing I'm going to do is put an I out front. Two numbers that give me 28 are 7 times 4. The square root of 4 is 2, so this becomes plus or minus 2i radical 7. And the last thing, to get the n by itself, I'm going to subtract 8. I cannot mush this 8 with the 2i radical 7, so my answer becomes n equals negative 8 plus or minus 2i radical 7. So this entire process you have done before. The only difference right now is that our answers are going to have the I because we have a negative underneath the radical. Second example. Again, first thing we're going to look at, we want letters on the left and numbers on the right. So I'm going to minus 80 from both sides. Now I have x squared plus 16x equals negative 89. Now I'm going to write my set of parentheses, and I'm going to put plus blank. I'm going to put an x in the front. I'm going to cut this in half. Half of 16 is 8. I'm going to square the 8, and that becomes 64. Now this becomes x plus 8 squared equals negative 89 plus 64 gives us negative 25. To get rid of the squared here, I'm going to square root both sides. Hopefully you realize the square root of negative 25, that becomes an I, that becomes a 5. So this becomes x plus 8 equals positive and negative 5i. Now to get x by itself, we're going to subtract 8 from both sides, and I get x equals negative 8 plus or minus 5i. I cannot combine these numbers because the 8 is a real number and the 5i is an imaginary number. Next example. First thing, letters on the left, numbers have to go to the right. So now I have x squared plus 16x equals negative 94. I'm going to set up with my parentheses. I'm going to cut this number in half. I guess they're all 8s in the examples. Sorry about that. Then I'm going to square it. It's going to become 64. Now I have x plus 8 squared equals negative 30. To get rid of a squared, We square root both sides. Now I'm going to simplify. That becomes an I. Numbers for 30 are 3, 10, 5, 6. You can't simplify it. So this becomes x plus 8 equals I radical 30, positive and negative. The last thing I'm going to do, and I should not have written those there, I'm going to minus 8 from both sides, and I get negative 8 plus or minus I radical 30. Last example. Again, first thing I want to do, letters on the left, numbers on the right, so I'm going to minus 96 from both sides. So I get x squared minus 18x equals 9 minus 96 is negative 87. Now I'm going to set up with my parentheses, equals negative 87 plus blank. I put an x here. Then I'm going to look at this number. Half of negative 18 is negative 9. Negative 9 squared is positive 81. So now I have x minus 9 squared equals negative 87 plus 81 is negative 6. To get rid of a squared, I'm going to square root both sides. So now I have x minus 9 equals, a negative under a radical means put an I out front, so plus or minus I radical 6. And the last thing I'm going to do is move my number over, so I get x equals 9 plus or minus I radical 6. Again, I cannot squish these together because the 9 is a real number and the I radical 6 is imaginary. Please make sure you write down any questions and either ask me next time you see me in class or email me.